really cool about Inger is that she's actually successfully done what I only know like one or two other people have done it, who have both been clinically active and had a research and academic career at the same time. And so she's done some really cool stuff, including like teaching cultural humility to medical students. I mean, that's really important and probably quite challenging. So that would by itself would be an interesting keynote. But as it happened, for this particular opportunity, it was so lucky for us because originally a gentleman named Lenny Hayes, who's a wonderful guy, who's was going to talk about two spirits, and he's he's a tribal representative in Minnesota, and unfortunately he had to cancel. And about that time, Inger sent me an email of personal joy because she published her new book. And I thought that I saw that and I said, oh my God, thank you, God. So this is an opportunity because, we like to amplify the voice of important people. So this seems like a good opportunity. Also, I love the fact that her book, for those of you who know me, know why I will love this. Her book is called Nobody Knows the Troubles I've Seen. A song lyric. So Inger, just so you know, one of my aspirations is to spend an entire day speaking only in song lyrics. So I saw this, I said, hey, I can talk about Inger's book during that day. Anyway, so there's the subline is the emotional lives of Black women. So Inger's going to talk today. I've lost my thing. The title of her talk is The Intersection of Race, Gender, Poverty, and Mental Health. And she's an associate professor at Northwestern University. She provides clinical treatment in the Asher Center, specializing on depression and anxiety, but does a whole lot of work in the community. So welcome, Inger. Thank you for gracing us with your wisdom. So looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, John, for that introduction. You minimize the role that you've had in my development and training. You were really kind of instrumental in my pathway. We spent many, many years together, and I'm so pleased that our paths continue to cross. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. And I think initially the book was kind of an opening for me to be a part of this conversation today. So what I thought that I would do is, while I'll talk about the book a little bit at the end, I really wanted to frame the discussion today around the research that I've done looking at disparities in mental illness and treatment, particularly among Black women, and the role that the intersection of race, gender, and poverty play on mental health. I have no disclosures to report. And I would like to start my talk today by discussing this idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. And when she started using this term, she was really talking about the place of Black women. In a paper in the University of Chicago Legal Forum, she wrote that traditional feminist ideas and anti-racist policies exclude Black women because they face overlapping discrimination that is unique to them. And she didn't believe that, discussions around separate discussions in either of these spaces was really giving honor to that intersectional experience that Black women face. She went on to say, because the intersectional experience is greater than the individual sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. Although Kimberly Crenshaw is really credited with this term of intersectionality, to be sure, the concept was brought forth prior to her coining the term. In 1981, Bell Hooks in Ain't I a Woman says, the struggle to end racism and the struggle to end sexism were naturally intertwined, that to make them separate was to deny a basic truth of our existence, that race and sex are both immutable facts of human identity. And so when we're talking about intersectional identities, in addition to race and gender, of course, there are many other identities that one can identify with, including education, sexuality, ability, age, ethnicity, culture, and class. And each of these identities have the potential to play a role in one's health outcomes, particularly mental health outcomes. A number of large epidemiological studies that have looked at the role of race specifically in the prevalence of mental illness when looking at outcomes as it's looking at differential outcomes among African Americans and the general population have found that, in fact, African Americans have the same or a lesser likelihood of developing a lifetime or past year mental illness. However, these studies do control for social and economic factors that we know to play a role on the likelihood of developing a mental illness and also participation in mental health treatment. These social determinants of health, as we call them, including employment, income, and federal living at or below the federal poverty level, can increase one's risk for developing mental illness. Having fewer years of education can increase one's risk for mental illness. The experience of racism and discrimination, exposure to stress, exposure to trauma can increase one's risk for having mental illness. And also access to the healthcare system, whereby those who are uninsured, those who have limited access to healthcare providers in their neighborhood are also more vulnerable to mental illness. And so when we think back on these kind of epidemiological studies that are looking at rates of mental illness by controlling for these social determinants of health or social economic factors, we're really seeing things differently than how they tend to occur in everyday life, not recognizing that indeed those who are African American and Hispanic are a lower percent have a college degree, higher rates of unemployment, lower average income, higher rates of poverty, and higher rates of those who are uninsured, and in turn increasing the vulnerability to mental illness in these populations. In the previous slide, I indicated racism and discrimination as a social determinant of health. However, that's really new to the conversation in terms of thinking about these social determinants of health. And in this kind of seminal article by Dr. Kamara Jones, I'm just going to read the second paragraph here. She says, "The variable race is only a rough proxy for social economic status, culture, and genes, but it precisely captures the social classification of people in a race-conscious society, such as the United States. Race noted on a health form is the same as race noted by a sales clerk, a police officer, or a judge. And this racial classification has a pronounced impact on the on the daily experience in the country. That is, the variable race is not a biological construct that reflects innate differences, but a social construct that precisely captures the impact of racism." So when we're looking at race in these epidemiological studies or in our randomized controlled trials or intervention studies, we're not only capturing one's identity, perhaps one's cultural experience, but also their assumed encounter with racism and the impact that racism might have on their health and their experience with the healthcare system. To be sure, context is key. Context plays a role in not only our access to resources, our exposure to poverty, violence, and the like, our exposure to racism. And so I share these three Chicago neighborhoods here. Perhaps John will recognize some of them. If we look on the left-hand side here, 60619, for those of you who are familiar with Chicago, this is the Chatham neighborhood. Of note, this is my childhood home, where in this neighborhood, the majority of residents are Black, 97% are Black. About 28% live at the federal poverty level. And the life expectancy is 72 years old. This is on the south side of Chicagoland map. If we come up the lake here, headed north, we're still on the south side here. This is the Oakland neighborhood. This specific place is the place where I conduct the majority of my research at the Coleman Home and Health Center, a federally qualified health center on the south side. Again, the majority of residents are Black, about a 36% household poverty level, and the life expectancy is 70 years old. If we keep coming up the lake, now we're in the Gold Coast, the campus of the medical school, Northwestern Hospital, where the majority of residents are white, 71% are white. The household poverty level drops to 12%. Meanwhile, the life expectancy jumps from where we started by 11 years to 83 years old. And so you may have seen many of these maps before that really, illustrate the role that neighborhood plays in access and in overall health outcomes. In a study that I and colleagues conducted using a national data set called the NESARC, National Epidemiological Study of Alcohol and Related Conditions, we looked at the association between ethnic identity, acculturation, and the prevalence of lifetime psychiatric disorders, and found that ethnic identity to be protective in terms of the development of lifetime psychiatric disorders for those who were Black, Hispanic, or Asian. In this study, ethnic identity was defined as having racial or ethnic pride, believing in the importance of your racial and ethnic heritage, having shared racial and ethnic values, attitudes, and behaviors. And acculturation was measured by language use proficiency and racial, ethnic, social preference. And what we found in this study was those who rated higher scores on the ethnic identity measure had a decreased odds of having a lifetime psychiatric disorder. And on the other hand, those who rated higher scores of acculturation had an increased odds of having a lifetime psychiatric disorder. And what we kind of hypothesized around these findings is that being embedded in your culture, being a part of a community where you are valued, where there's a sense of belonging, where there are shared resources is potentially protective of long-term mental illness. And on the other hand, separation or loss of this community, these values is potentially a risk factor. The American Psychological Association puts out a annual report looking at the role of stress, and in general, the top stressors that are reported nationwide are money, work, the economy, family responsibilities, and health. However, we know that in addition to these stressors, that African Americans face additional stressors, including employment and employment stability, unemployment, higher rates of poverty, exposure to racism and discrimination, daily hassles like encounters in stores, encounters with the police, and higher risk of exposure to trauma. When thinking about Black women specifically, Black women face an additional provider and caregiver stress. We know that although Black women in several recent reports have been noted as the race ethnic group who attain the largest proportion of college degrees, college educated women earn less than those who are white. A fourth of Black women in the US live in poverty compared to 11% of white women. 9% of Black women are unemployed. 2/3 of Black children live with a single mother, and 80% of Black mothers are the sole earner or earn more than 40% of the income in their household. And so thinking about this kind of in a general context, when you think of the role of the Black woman in the Black family and Black community, whereby there's this additional economic stress, but in addition to that economic stress, there's also a greater expectation of being that provider and caregiver in the Black family. Thinking about racism and discrimination, additionally, as a stressor that uniquely impacts the Black community and Black women specifically in terms of their mental health. About 76% of Black and 72% of Hispanic adults report daily discrimination, such as being treated with less respect, threatened, or harassed. 25% of Black women report receiving microaggressions at least monthly. And those who face racism, discrimination, and microaggressions also report feeling more stress. And we know that this stress has an impact not only on mental health, but on the physiological body, contributing to the production of more cortisol, which can have negative impacts on a number of chronic health conditions. Going back to this idea of the role that racism plays in the development, the role that racism plays as a stressor. This can start from an early age. In this report, Girlhood Interrupted, the erasure of Black girls' girlhood, this term adultification was coined. And what this report found was that people in general saw, or white adults saw, Black girls as needing less nurturing, less protection, less support, less comfort. Black girls were perceived as being more independent, knowing more about adult topics, including sex. And these beliefs, the ways in which these kind of foundational attitudes contributes to harsher punishment, giving Black girls fewer opportunities for leadership and mentorship, contributing to disproportionate involvement in the criminal justice system, greater use of force, not only with involvement in the criminal justice system, involvement with police officials, but also in the school system, and harsher penalties overall. And so this study really highlights the ways that exposure to racism from an early age can really negatively impact the development of Black girls who later become women. Thinking about trauma as a source of stress, of course, there's a full spectrum of trauma that can include sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and neglect, traumatic grief and separation, interpersonal violence, community violence, natural disaster, war, terrorism, serious accident, or illness. And we know that Black girls and women have higher rates of exposure to trauma than the general population. Black children are more likely to experience child maltreatment, physical and sexual abuse. Black adults have the highest cumulative number of traumatic events and higher rates of PTSD. And as we indicated a couple of slides ago, Black adults are more likely to live in poverty, and poverty increases the risk of exposure to violent crime. In addition to these direct experiences and exposures to trauma, it's important to also take into account the intergenerational trauma that often presents in Black families, whereby one is not only potentially directly coming into contact with trauma, but experiencing the residue of trauma or witnessing trauma experienced by their parent, or receiving the negative emotional impact of a parent or someone in their community who has not had the opportunity to adequately address their trauma symptoms. Finally, I think it's important to also mention, particularly in the context of the last 18 months, whereby attention to police violence, Black men dying at the hands of police. This discussion of vicarious trauma is really important to underscore, particularly when you're thinking about people who likely have already had their direct personal experience with trauma, who stand to be more vulnerable to exposures to vicarious trauma in the news, in the media, in conversation. And these exposures could serve as triggers in exacerbating the negative mental health impact. Thinking about intimate partner violence specifically, we know that 12 million people per year experience intimate partner violence. About a third of women experience physical violence by intimate partner in their lifetime, and Black women are more likely to experience it than white women. I just want to name the names of the people that are represented on the slide here. Naila Franklin from Chicago, who died as a result of intimate partner violence in 2007 at the hands of someone that she had been dating. Dr. Tamara O'Neal, who was a physician here in Chicago. Perhaps you remember her story. She died in 2018 at the hands of an intimate partner upon their separation. And Aisha Fraser in 2018, who also died at the hands of a partner whom she had been separated from. And these stories of, you know, beautiful Black women who were well-loved, well-revered. Aisha was a mother of 2 children, really highlight that this idea that in each of their cases, their deaths followed their separation from their partners. And we know that the data say that 50% of female homicide victims are killed by intimate partners, and 50 to 75% of domestic violence happens at the point of separation. Although 2 of these stories, Naila Franklin and Dr. O'Neal, were pretty widely publicized, I just want to again name their names and also recognize that so many other Black women, and people die as a result of intimate partner violence and are less recognized. Going back to the earlier point that poverty increases the risk of exposure to violent crime and increases the risk of exposure to trauma. If you look at the city maps of the city, you will see that on the right is the map demonstrating higher neighborhoods that have a higher density of people who are living at or below the federal poverty line. And on the left side, the map is of where the majority of homicides are happening across the city. And if you look at kind of these dark spots of homicides, they really overlap with the dark sides of dark spots of poverty, really demonstrating the relationship between not only poverty and violence and trauma. These yellow circles are highlighted because that is the area in which my research is based. I showed you that slide earlier of the COMED Home and Health Center, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So my work that is focused majority Black women, really looking at the effectiveness and implementation of a mindfulness-based intervention for depression in a community-based health center. And I just want to present a little bit of data from this work. This column and body represents the people who were actively enrolled in the study. This column is data for the Oakland neighborhood, whereby the study is focused, and the final column on the right represents the statistics for Chicago at large. And so in the study, we at this time had enrolled about 43% of the women were single mothers. The majority of them had some college education or less. The unemployment rate was about 26%, and about 37% were living at or below the federal poverty line. These data are pretty reflective of the Oakland neighborhood at large. However, we do see a higher proportion in the study of single mothers. but the education data, poverty, and unemployment data are relatively the same. If you look at these characteristics as compared to Chicago at large, it is a more under-resourced, disadvantaged population. And in general, Oakland ranks 28th for violent crime, 11th for property crime, and 17th for quality of life among Chicago's 77 neighborhoods. This is just to give a little bit of context as we looked at exposure to trauma for women who enrolled in these pilot studies. And we found that about 51% reported some exposure to trauma, with the majority of those traumas being physical or sexual assault, domestic violence, or trauma related to witnessing a murder or a death. Additionally, about 30% of the women in our sample met criteria for PTSD, and an additional 7% met criteria for what we called sub-threshold PTSD, which can be understood as having a significant amount of PTSD symptoms, however, not meeting full criteria for PTSD. And this is significantly greater than what we know the general statistics to be for the rate of PTSD among adults in general. When looking at some of the trauma experiences that our participants reported, about 90% experienced multiple forms of trauma. Some of the most common traumas reported were being in a car accident, having an unwanted sexual experience, sexual assault, or having a life-threatening illness or injury. So everything that we've discussed, exposure to racism, trauma exposure, daily life stressors, exposure to experiences with poverty, can all be thought of as various types of stress. And this stress can contribute to not only our mental health, but our physical health, leading to people feeling more irritable and angry, having a direct relationship with the likelihood of developing depression or anxiety, physical symptoms such as headaches, fatigue, gastrointestinal issues, muscle tightness and tension, and other behavioral signs such as sleep disruption, unhealthy eating, and substance abuse. And we know that this stress has a direct impact on health outcomes, generally speaking, whereby those who are Black have a 4-year less life expectancy than those who are white. Stress being related to a number of maternal health outcomes, including maternal mortality, low birth weight, preterm birth, increasing the likelihood of miscarriage, other health outcomes such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and opioid deaths. And many of these chronic health conditions, namely the maternal health outcomes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity, are chronic health conditions that we know to be disproportionately prevalent among African American women. Maternal mortality among Black women is something that has been given increasing attention in recent years. And this is just to document the disparity that's seen among Black women, and that's been persistent for over the last 15 years, whereby Black women, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Black women are 2 to 3 times as likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. Thinking about the sum of stress and the impact that stress has, Dr. Arlene Geronimus coined this term, the weathering hypothesis, whereby she identified that Black adults experience early health deterioration as a result of repeated exposure to social and economic diversity. And this weathering term that she coined is a measure of 10 biomarkers related to stress, blood pressure, cholesterol, BMI, and others, and found that Black women specifically were most likely to have a high weathering score. So this can be thought of as really wear and tear on the body, whereby the body is deteriorating at a more rapid pace due to this exposure to stress. She found that by age 45, 50% of Black women had a high weathering score, and these scores were not fully accounted for by poverty. Along these lines, we see that disability related to mental illness is increasing. This data is old, but we know that recent trends are continuing in the same direction. And additionally, there's been a lot of reports in recent years talking about the rates of suicide among Black adults and specifically among Black youth as increasing. When looking at the data on suicide among Black youth, this report that came out 2 years ago in pediatrics in November 2019 found that white, Hispanic, and Asian American Pacific Islander youth had an overall decrease in suicide attempts, while Black youth had an increase in suicide attempts, and there was a significant increase in injury by suicide attempt for Black boys. The numbers have been increasing. I believe the most recent estimate I saw was a 72% increase dating back from the early 2000s to about 2017. Similarly, just a couple weeks ago, actually, there was a report put out by JCAP noting that the suicide rate for Black girls increased by 6.6% per year from 2003 into 2017. I think that it's incredibly important to raise awareness around the risk of suicide for Black youth, as there's a commonly held kind of misperception, particularly in the Black community, that Black folks aren't at risk for suicide attempts or death by suicide. And so awareness of these trends is critically important. Similarly, we see a rise in opioid deaths increasing for Black adults. And, as discussions around the opioid crisis have, proliferated, a lot of this Black folks have really been lost in that discussion. And, just highlighting the rate of opioid deaths as compared to among African Americans as compared to white adults and the general population. These red lines are the lines in which they're the highest rates of opioid deaths. So taking all of this into account, thinking about the multiple risk factors for exposure to stress, exposure to trauma, likelihood of developing a mental health condition, we also know that about 40 to 60% of adults with depression do not receive mental health treatment, and Black and Hispanic adults are 40 to 60% less likely than whites to receive treatment. Those who are more likely are those who are women, who have a previous diagnosis, have greater psychiatric comorbidity, more severe symptoms, have experienced their symptoms for longer periods of time. And those who are less likely are racial ethnic minorities, men, younger, and who are under-resourced, less education, more poverty, and the uninsured. With that, we see disparities in healthcare continuing to increase. And these disparities this discrimination is operating at multiple levels, including the individual and patient provider level. These disparities are across illnesses and across healthcare services, and are really driven not only by race and ethnicity, but also by socioeconomic status. One thing that I just want to kind of mention to the side here that really highlights that, socioeconomic status does not kind of discount the vulnerability to disparities in healthcare, particularly among Black women. There have been a lot of, really high profile examples of maternal risk among, Black women who are well resourced. Serena Williams is one example. Beyonce is another example of Black women who are well resourced to report experience being discounted in the healthcare system, having really, high risk pregnancies where they felt unheard, and it's believed to race ethnicity is believed to have played a part in that. Similarly, anecdotally, similar reports by Black women in my clinical practice, particularly during pregnancy, feeling unheard by medical care providers, having pain discounted, having symptoms discounted, and ultimately feeling at increased risk and leading to some significant vulnerability during the pregnancy and postpartum phase. More kind of gloomy data, we do not see these disparities in health outcomes improving when we look at these trends from 1990 to 2020. The gap is not closing across kind of average health outcomes, income disparities, Black-white disparities, health equity metrics. We see that gap top to bottom continuing to persist over the past 30 years. Shifting a little bit to talk about kind of mental health policy, my comments are really focused on mental health in Illinois. There were a lot of, really highly publicized discussions around mental health funding about 10 years ago. Between 2009 and 2012, the state experienced significant cuts in mental health funding. There were fewer state-funded mental health services available. And as this happened, we also saw an increase in ER visits, nights in homeless shelters, and incarceration rates. And this map on the right really documents where the placement of safety net providers. The previous clinic that I discussed, the COMED Home and Health Center, would be considered a safety net provider, really demonstrating the areas across the city where there are a dearth of these safety net providers. And this is on the south. I'm pointing here as if you can see me, but this is on the south and west sides of the city. Also, that was, really widely discussed and pretty controversial at the time was the closing of a number of mental health centers, state-funded mental health centers across the city. And of note, these state-funded centers were concentrated on the south and west sides of the city where the mental health needs were great. More recently, in 2019, our mayor has tripled our mental health budget, providing specific funding to community health centers to expand the availability of mental health services, having funding earmarked for a trauma response team, providing trauma-informed care, as well as having a mobile crisis intervention team, developing a helpline through 311 to link people to mental health services. What was found was that even in areas where services were available, data that was collected demonstrated that people didn't really have adequate knowledge in terms of where to go to get these services. So it was kind of a two-pronged problem where in some spaces there weren't services, and in some spaces there were services, but people didn't know that they were there or know how to get them. And so this 311 help link is designed to help close the gap on that. And then finally, a new mental health campaign has been widely launched to reduce stigma and increase education around mental health. All that said, there remain a number of barriers to mental health treatment that are particularly pronounced in the African American community, those barriers being cost, lack of identification of need, concern about prejudice and discrimination in the healthcare system, other structural barriers, and not believing that services will help. One thing that I'm particularly interested is in how attitudes or beliefs around mental health really impact one's likelihood of accessing treatment. And I see this to be particular, and studies also support this. Uh, Studies also demonstrate the same, that this is highly prevalent or more likely to be prevalent among Black adults. So the idea that I don't need treatment, the problem will get better on its own. I can solve the problem on its own. Treatment will not be effective. Concern about shame and embarrassment in participation in treatment, fear of being identified as crazy or weak, concern about the impact of medications, believing that medication might be addictive, concerns about side effects, fear or judgment of feeling misunderstood, mistrust of the mental health service system. All of these being attitudes and beliefs that can be barriers to accessing the mental health service system. I think it's important to underscore this because when I think of barriers as being concrete or psychological, with concrete barriers being some of those things that were on the previous slide: cost, insurance, time, availability of providers, all of these that are structural factors that are important to be addressed. But similarly, these psychological barriers also being important in terms of how one's individual beliefs play a role in their accessing of the system. As a complement to the paper that I discussed early on, colleagues and I conducted another examination of ethnic identity and acculturation, this time looking at its impact on psychiatric service utilization, and found that those who rated a higher ethnic identity was associated with decreased odds of using psychiatric services for those who are Black or Hispanic. And those who had a higher acculturation was associated with increased odds of using psychiatric services for those who were Hispanic. And so when thinking about this, one of the hypotheses is that for certain ethnicities or cultures, the idea of participation in mental health treatment might be contrary to what is the norm in that individual's culture, and in turn, making them less likely to engage in treatment. On the other hand, those who are more acculturated, who perhaps have created more distance from their culture of origin and integrated with the larger white, US culture, might be more likely to engage in mental health treatment. I want to note the role of spirituality, particularly in the African American community. Historically, the church has really been a place that people go to, not only for physical health, not only for mental health problems, but also physical health problems. And studies have shown that Black adults are more likely than whites to use religious support as mental health treatment. And so as a provider, I'm also a practicing psychologist, it's important when we are doing our clinical work to think about the role that spirituality might play in one's mental health treatment, and examine ways to explore it as a complement. Some of the help that people report receiving from clergy is reading the Bible, just having someone to listen, offering general advice and comfort and sympathy. And studies have shown that those who attend church report higher subjective religiosity are less likely to have mental illness, including any disorders, mood disorders, or substance use disorders. And so all of this leads me to my book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen: The Emotional Lives of Black Women. And this book is really an integration of my clinical work with Black women, my research focused on mental health in the Black community, with a deep understanding of the disparities at play in mental health in the Black community and Black women, some of the specific cultural factors that really play a role in how Black women express their mental health challenges and decide to get treatment or not. And with that in mind, a few years ago, I wrote an article called "The Strong and Stressed Black Woman" for the New York Times. And this article really discussed who the strong Black woman is, how she presents to the outside world, and some of the internal challenges that she might be battling with that are less often recognized. And so when we think about the strong Black woman, thinking about the Black woman who is strong in all situations, she's resilient, self-sufficient, able to succeed despite having limited access to resources. She can do it all by herself. She's a provider and caretaker, and her strength is often grounded in her deep religion and spirituality. On the other side of this strong Black woman is someone who might be suppressing their emotion, as they've been taught not to display fear or weakness. They resist vulnerability, tend to not ask for help, self-sacrificing, and in that they deprioritize their individual needs for the needs of others, or particularly the community. Often very exhausted, overstretched, overburdened, and might be internally wrestling with these feelings of stress, depression, and anxiety that I mentioned earlier. And so in my book, I tell the untold stories of strong Black women, women that you likely work with, that are in your community, that are at your church, that are at your workplace, that you see as being, strong, successful, able to do it all, but not recognizing the deep impact that these internal struggles are having on mental and physical health. In addition to telling the stories, I provide some of the research that I outlined in the presentation today, and additionally offer clinical strategies to help Black women, women in general, and those who are allies for identifying and coping with trauma.